So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, please, Mark Hines and Julie Muscat.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Hines, and with me is my colleague, Julie Masker. We're coming from Wilmington, Delaware, in the United States. We're going to talk about enhancing mouthfeel and reduced-calorie beverages. We're talking today a little bit more specifically about the category called flavored beverages. So the content of our presentation, first of all, we're going to talk about growing trends in reduced-calorie beverages. Why is there growing interest in these beverages? We'll talk about the mouthfeel in beverages, trying to characterize what does mouthfeel mean. We'll talk about hydrocolloids, commonly used hydrocolloids in beverages for developing mouthfeel. Julie's going to present 2 case studies, and we'll finish up with our conclusions. So to talk about sugar-sweetened beverages and the link to obesity, I think the evidence is fairly obvious out there that there's a growing obesity. Some of that may be attributed to beverages. Clearly there's behavioral habits that are growing, contributing to increasing obesity around the world, certainly in the developing regions, but also now being acknowledged in developing regions as well. Some studies that point this out, there can be some causal relationships, some of it may be behavior rather than actually the effect, but children, it's been observed that consume more than 12 ounces of juice a day are more likely to be overweight. And that's a study from 1997. Showing how the growth of children, particularly in the body mass index, which is another measure of obesity, the charts in some ways are obsolete from the United States. At 95 percentile, well, about 17% of the children are in the top 5%, so to speak, in body mass index, which means we clearly have a growing obesity problem in developed countries. What's also been observed is that the added sugar consumption is about 50% in the United States, throughout all age groups, all demographic groups. About 50% of the added sugar consumption comes from carbonated soft drinks and fruit drinks. Now, to look at beverage consumption over time, particularly with the bar graph showing changes over 20 years, we looked at the late 1970s, 1977 to 1978, and compared about 20 years later, and actually not even quite 20 years later, about 17 to 18 years later, we can see quite a shift. It was represented by the blue bar is the milk consumption. Whether it's for boys, which are the 2 sets of bars on the left, or for girls, we can see that milk has decreased considerably. And the increase in sweetened beverages has grown tremendously. Soft drinks is actually what's represented by the red bar. More recent data, 1999 to year 2002, we see that the calorie increase has been relatively high, and milk again is reducing. So there's clearly an increase in sugar-sweetened beverages over the last 20 to 30 years. Now there are formulation challenges with reduced calorie beverages. I think it's clear to this audience there's a lot of mixed messages out there that often fuel negative perceptions about high-intensity sweeteners. Products like aspartame have been out in the market well over 30 years now. Sucralose is more new. There's a growing negative perception about these products. Some of it's not particularly well-founded, but it's in the consumer mindset. The media talks about this quite frequently. There's also clearly a growing negative perception about high fructose corn syrup, particularly in the United States, where it's most predominantly used. One of the challenges in formulations about using high-intensity sweeteners is that they do not have similar sweetness profiles as sucrose or high fructose corn syrup. They tend to dissipate much more quickly. There tends to be a much sharper peak in the sweetness, and so clearly a different type of sweetener profile. The other challenge is that when you use less sugar solids in beverages, you're going to have a reduced mouthfeel. The body's going to be lost, it's going to feel thinner, it's going to feel lighter. And that also affects flavor delivery. So to define mouthfeel in beverages, from our side of the business, when we work with hydrocolloids and we work with beverages, we find it quite challenging to define what is mouthfeel, what does it really mean. We'll define it as the oral physical sensation during beverage consumption. And saying beverage consumption in itself is very complex. It could be actually perceived somewhat by swirling a bottle, pre-drinking, pre-entering the mouth. When it enters the mouth, that's part of the sensation, and the swallowing swallowing sensation as well. A number of factors affect the mouthfeel in beverages. The density of the weight perceived on the tongue. So when we use high-soluble sugars, high-soluble solids or sugars, it's going to increase the density. It's going to give a perception and a feeling of being thicker, heavier, and it gets essentially just a better, heavier weight on the tongue or in the mouth. Viscosity and rheology, and there's different types of viscosities and different types of rheologies. Of course, viscosity can be just simply measured by high or low viscosity, but the rheology type, which I'll give a little bit more detail in an upcoming slide. Temperature gradients and temperature variations, that's clearly an issue as well in mouthfeel. If you're drinking a cold beverage or a hot beverage, it's going to be at a different temperature than the mouth. And so there will be a gradient as the temperature starts acclimating to the mouth temperature. Saliva effects are very important in mouthfeel. It has a dilution effect. It can affect the mouthfeel considerably. Flavor release, particularly dependent upon how the product is flavored. If it's naturally flavored with that, or naturally flavored, or it's had added flavors to it, whether they're artificial or natural flavors, it's going to have different type of flavor release, and that's going to affect the flavor of the mouthfeel of the beverage. And also mouth coating. That may be a little bit more related to protein-containing beverages or fat-containing beverages. So we try to characterize mouthfeel and look at the existing science in mouthfeel. And actually, when we look at the most recent up-to-date literature on mouthfeel, it's kind of deferring to how difficult it is. I just found this article that's very recent. Matter of fact, I think this is actually a preprint. From Stokes in 2013 in Current Opinion in Colloid and Interface Science. Kind of really avoiding actually characterizing mouthfeel in some ways, but I think maybe accurately acknowledging it's very hard to characterize mouthfeel. So I will read one line out of this. We cannot currently predict these properties using fundamental rheological properties of the food and beverage, or through measurements derived from imitative or empirical techniques such as texture profile analysis using a texture analyzer. So what we're essentially saying is it's very hard to actually truly quantify mouthfeel. We all know what mouthfeel is, consumers, young children, adults, all know what a mouthfeel is, what's a good mouthfeel, but to try to characterize it from any type of standard rheological measurements or empirical measurements is very elusive. It's a very complex science. So what affects mouthfeel in beverage formulation? So that's where we come in, that's how we work with beverage formulators. There's a number of factors. Well, clearly one of the first things is soluble solids. So soluble solids are most likely to be sugar or high fructose corn syrup. This is going to be a very large contributor to mouthfeel. With beverage formulations that may have 10 to 12% sugar in them, that's going to be substantial contribution to the mouthfeel. Insoluble solids, which would be perhaps fruit solids most likely, is going to add a mouthfeel to it. It may give somewhat of a more coarse texture depending on the type of beverage. If they're very finely processed fruit solids, it may add some more of a fullness and richness with the smoothness. So there can be substantial variation just depending upon the size of the fruit solids. Proteins and fat, if it's a dairy-containing beverage, for example, or a soy-containing beverage, that's going to add to the mouthfeel. It's also going to impact the flavor delivery. Polyphenolic compounds, which can be very complex, that will also add astringency and add some mouthfeel effects to it. And then hydrocolloids, which is going to be the focus of our presentation. Other components of beverages that may affect mouthfeel, certainly alcohol will. Carbonation affects the mouthfeel dramatically. And then flavors, added flavors will affect the mouthfeel. To kind of describe and characterize the beverages that we're going to talk about in our presentation, we're going by the EU standard of flavored beverages. Although we work throughout the world, we're clearly a global type of organization, and you're a global audience as well. So there'll be different definitions of beverages depending where you're at in the world. We're not talking about necessarily defined fruit juices or fruit nectars. We're talking about flavored beverages that may or may not use fruit juice. These products are going to be either no calorie or reduced calorie. And in these cases we're talking about low pH, so they're going to be below 4.6, most typically in the 3.5 to 3.8 range. Beverages may be clear or they may be opaque. We're talking about ready-to-drink beverages, or we're talking about concentrates that will be obviously diluted to make ready-to-drink. Typical examples, low juice beverages, fruit juice purees, reduced sugar beverages, and fruit juice concentrates. Now look at hydrocolloids for mouthfeel, that's our business. Polysaccharides are typically what hydrocolloids are. There are some exceptions. You could consider a hydrocolloid to be a protein-based product, perhaps like a whey protein isolate. But most commonly it's polysaccharides. Gelatin also can be considered a hydrocolloid, which is a protein. But defining as polysaccharides, polysaccharides do not truly dissolve in water. They remain in colloidal dispersion. Because they do not become fully dissolved, they are not soluble solids, they do not affect the colligative properties of freezing point and boiling point, and they do not add to the bricks. Now there may be some components of some hydrocolloids that we add to bricks. As commonly in pectin, there will be added sugar that may add to the bricks slightly. Commonly used ingredients, hydrocolloids for mouthfeel and beverages, cellulose gum, pectin, and xanthan gum. These are probably the most common, but other ingredients are used. Quick look at pectin. Pectin is used in beverages. It's characteristic in that it typically is a very low viscosity type of product. It has a rheology that tends to be Newtonian, which means that it's essentially the same viscosity no matter what the shear rate. Pectin does require a higher temperature for dissolution, typically about 70 degrees C to fully dissolve it. It is typically sourced from apple pomace for citrus peel. Cellulose gum. And Ashland represents cellulose gum to the beverage industry. Cellulose is sourced from wood pulp or cotton linters. It's processed to make it water soluble. Cellulose is found in nature is actually very insoluble because it's the primary structural component of plant material. As we process the product, we make it cold or hot water soluble. We also have the ability to get different characteristics. Characteristics can include viscosity and rheology. We can have low viscosity to very high viscosity. We can impart different types of rheology, which I'll demonstrate in the upcoming slide. We can affect the water solubility, which means we can actually have a very fast hydration to a slower hydration type of product. We can vary the structure to get more or less acid tolerance. It's typically important to have acid tolerance in low pH juice type beverages. And we can vary the particle size. The value of varying particle size may be actually in the handling. A large particle size, we call the coarse size, can reduce the dust considerably, which is important in processing plants. If it's necessary to have a very fast hydration, we have very fine particle sizes. They're typically better suited for powdered beverages, but also can deliver very fast hydration. So when we actually put a carboxyl methyl group on cellulose gum, put it onto the backbone of cellulose, it impacts the rheology. It gets different types of viscosity, it gets different types of behavior, whether it's Newtonian or very non-Newtonian. It can actually impact the solubility, so a higher number of carboxymethyl groups will increase the solubility. It actually adds to the pH tolerance, depending upon how it's distributed on the backbone. And it also increases salt tolerance, which is not usually a big issue with beverages, occasionally can be. Now to look very simplistically on the rheology, a Newtonian product, a typical example that's not beverage, would be honey, which means it has the same viscosity whether it's a low shear rate or very high shear rate. And represented on this graph, we see a Newtonian behavior, which is essentially a horizontal line, and then we see a non-Newtonian behavior, which is showing a decrease with increasing shear rates. Now this is a very simplistic model of non-Newtonian behavior. There can be many different types of it. There can be time-dependent and time-independent types of non-Newtonian behavior. But it essentially means that with increasing shear, you're reducing the viscosity. So why this is important is that with a Newtonian behavior, which is typically what's preferred in a beverage, you're going to have viscosity that's similar at all types of shears. So shear that's very low would be at rest, as the bottle is just simply sitting on a shelf. Pouring is a higher amount of shear, but it's still relatively low compared to the process of drinking a beverage. Swallowing is a very high amount of shear. And this all impacts the perceived viscosity and rheology on the mouthfeel. A non-Newtonian product means it actually thins out with shear. So with the complex rheology or complex behavior of drinking a product, the viscosity is going to be reduced. Now looking at how we impact our product, cellulose gum, by giving distribution patterns, We can see on the top we've got the parallel horizontal lines of uniform substitution. And the vertical lines are representing the substituents, carboxymethyl groups on the backbone of cellulose. So this is representing something that's very Newtonian, or very smooth flow, and it's a very uniform substitution. If we choose to have a pattern that's more in block patterns, as represented on the bottom, then we have a product that tends to reassociate itself, and it creates a more of a thixotropic behavior. The next slide can show that. On the left side is a product that's very thixotropic. Now these are very high concentrations. These are 1 or 2% concentrations, which would be extremely unusual for beverage formulation, but showing an exaggerated profile of what the rheology looks like. So a thixotropic behavior on the left would be very non-Newtonian, and that would not typically be a desirable behavior for beverage formulations. There could be some exceptions. If you're seeking extreme suspension of fruit solids, for example, a thixotropic behavior would be more of an enhancement for that. But it's going to be perceived as a little bit slimy on the mouth. What's going to be generally more preferred is going to be what's on the right side, which is non-thixotropic or very Newtonian behavior. And that's essentially a very smooth flow of the hydrocolloid. So that leads us through a background on mouthfeel and hydrocolloids for beverages. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Julie. She's going to talk about case studies that she's actually driven on enhancing mouthfeel and reduced-calorie beverages.
Hi there. So like Mark said, I'm going to run you through some case studies. The first one, the customer needed a reduced-calorie fruit-flavored beverage with a mouthfeel similar to the full-calorie version by reducing the juice content. So by reducing the juice content in the beverage, there was reduced soluble solids that resulted in a loss of the mouthfeel. So I actually identified an optimum viscosity modifier, the cellulose gum, and put it into the formulation. So the first formulation that I came up with for the customer was a fruit-flavored concentrate that then they would dilute down with carbonated water for a sparkling fruit-flavored beverage. So you can see here it is flavored with apple, blueberry, red raspberry, and strawberry juice. It does have an artificial sweetener, sucralose, in it, but I did choose a higher degree of substitution, cellulose gum, which gave it a more syrup-like smooth consistency. They also requested an apple juice. Since a lot of young children like to drink apple juice, they wanted to reduce the calories by reducing the juice. So I chose a very low viscosity grade that we have that helped to give a very light mouthfeel for this application. So I did a comparison between our cellulose gum and the Pectin, and you can see some results that I have on the next few slides. So I did the same thing as well with a mixed berry flavored beverage. It contained the same flavors as the carbonated juice and contains sucralose and cellulose gum as well. So you can see here that cellulose gum is highly cost effective when compared to Pectin. Some of the prices on the slide, you can see that they are calculated on a cost per use basis at a level of 0.25%, which is what the cellulose gum and the Pectin were used in the formulation. And these are some of the pictures of the juices that I formulated. On the right-hand side, you will see the mixed berry juice. And on the left-hand side, you will see the apple juice with the cellulose gum and the Pectin. So what this demonstrates is that the Pectin tends to give a haze to the beverage. So when manufacturers and product developers are looking for a very clear juice, you tend to want to use cellulose gum for that property. So I did some triangle tests with some of our consumers at the research center, and no statistical significant difference was found between cellulose gum and Pectin in the mixed berry flavored drink and the apple flavored drink. I also have been using some of our rheological resources at the research center to try to find some way to quantify the viscosity of the mixed berry flavored drink. And I have been using a capillary viscometer for this. You can see the very top line is the low sugar, and I actually chose a high viscosity grade of our cellulose gum, so it's something that wouldn't typically be used. The very baseline is water, so that's what is the reference for this application. And And then you can see the red line is our full sugar control, which is sweetened with either sucrose or high fructose corn syrup. The green line is the juice that is modified for the mouthfeel using our CMC. So you can see that the two lines, the green line and the red line, are extremely close. And that just validates the work that I had done with our triangle test, showing that consumers prefer that grade. So a little bit of background on stevia. It was approved for GRAS status in the United States in 2008 and in the EU in 2011. It's a very low-calorie, high-intensity sweetener, and it's about 300 times the sweetness of sucrose. It's thermostable up to 200 degrees C, and the sweetness is derived by diterpene glycosides. So the second case study I'm going to run you through is an enhanced mouthfeel of stevia-sweetened ready-to-drink flavored beverages. The customer needed to lower the calories without a negative impact on mouthfeel in a nectar-like mango beverage. So they wanted to reduce the amount of sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, replacing that with stevia, and of course that results in a lack of mouthfeel because you're taking out those soluble solids. So I added in cellulose gum to this mango nectar-like formulation. It's about 14% 9% high fructose corn syrup for the full sugar version. And I reduced that down by 50% down to 4.5, and added in stevia at a very low usage level, and added in a specific grade of our cellulose gum in at 0.08%. So just a very small amount of cellulose gum will build back that mouthfeel that is lost when you're taking out those soluble solids. I also did a triangle test on this as well with our participants at the research center, and no statistical significant difference was found between the full calorie version and the 50% reduced sugar version. And I would also like to point out that when you reduce the sugar by 50% in this formulation, you're getting a 30% reduction in calories per serving and an 18% reduction in sugars per serving. So that's a nice starting point for a product developer to work with. So in conclusion, hydrocolloids are highly effective for enhancing the mouthfeel and sensory performance in reduced and no-calorie flavored beverages. And Ashland cellulose gum may assist in flavor delivery and flavor balance of beverages using stevia extracts, because it does help to round out the flavor of the stevia in the beverages as well.